Hello, and welcome to Sustainabl Outlook, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the transactions, technologies, and trends in the sustainable economy. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out with suggested topics or guests, or questions about how we can work together to create a sustainable economy.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainabl Outlook. I'm Molly Barker, an attorney in the environmental and energy practice at K&L Gates. I'm very excited to be joined today by Nicole DeNamur, founder of Sustainabl Strategies, a consulting firm based in Seattle, Washington, that advises companies to do a variety of things, three of which is advise and manage the risks of sustainable innovation so they can do great work without the surprises, create collaborative spaces and uniting diverse groups to mitigate climate change through the built environment, and address the intersection of buildings with human health and wellness. Before launching Sustainabl Strategies, Nicole practiced construction and insurance coverage law in the Seattle area for more than a decade, her experience from which she leverages to help her clients achieve robust sustainability goals. Nicole is a WELL AP in faculty, honorary AIA, Fitwell Ambassador, Eco Districts AP, and Lead Green Associate, and has taught graduate courses at the University of Washington and Boston Architectural College. Thanks so much for joining us, Nicole.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
So from my understanding, Sustainabl Strategies advises on three primary pillars that I want to hear more about and dig into. The first area is healthy buildings. Can you explain what healthy buildings mean and how they're better equipped to manage risk, and how third-party healthy building certification programs verify the, quote, health of a building?
You're going to have to remind me of all three of those questions as I work through them. But let's start with the first one. So a healthy building is an interesting question because it looks a lot like how we defined, being a podcast, people can't see me, but like I do air quotes, right, with green building, which meant very different things to many different people when the green building kind of movement started, which was in the early 90s. And then we had third-party certification systems like LEED. People are, I think, generally familiar with at least what LEED is. And that really, drove kind of this market transformation, and third-party certification systems really give us a common language around these terms. It can be really difficult to define a sustainable, high-performing building. And if if I got 10 of my, colleagues who are practitioners who work in the same space like me, I bet we would all say something different because it does get so technical pretty quickly. So, kind of taking that context and as green and sustainable design and construction and operations evolved into kind of including these notions of, which seems like common sense, it was kind of like groundbreaking at the time, like, oh, we should really think about the occupants of these spaces, not just the, energy and water performance are very important from an environmental standpoint. I can't underscore that enough, particularly right now. But, also we spend 90% of our time indoors, and that's a North American average pre-pandemic. And so, to me, when I kind of started digging into what is a healthy building, and I promise I'll get to your question, that was kind of the shocking thing of, wow, we spend 90% of our time indoors, and we put little to no thought into what that space is, how it impacts us. And the research is growing and growing that shows exactly how many negative impacts traditional, using air quotes again, buildings have on our health and wellness. So what is a healthy building? There's lots of different ways to define it, which probably frustrates people who are listening to things like this. It frustrates me as a practitioner working in this space. That's why I have like way too many acronyms after my name of various third-party certification programs that I'm a part of. But there's kind of like, three, I guess at least three examples I give. There's the WELL building standard, which is monitored and created by the International Well Building Institute. And so they'll divide it into about 10 concepts. So things like mind, nutrition, community. There's Fitwell, which is, interestingly, was actually pioneered by the GSA, the General Services Administration, and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, which I'm very well aware of what that is now. It is currently facilitated by the Center for Active Design. There was actually an RFP for the entity that was going to monitor that. So that's very different than WELL. People always want me to kind of compare them, but I always say it's an apples to oranges comparison, not apples to apples. If you've walked into a commercial space, you may have seen a WELL or a Fitwell designation. There are various spaces in Seattle that are certified, just like you might see a LEED plaque on a building. And then there are kind of academic standards like Harvard School of Public Health has been very, I would say, one of the leading institutions with respect to healthy buildings research. Joe Allen is one of the main researchers there. If you've watched any major media news outlet during the pandemic, he was talking about air quality on literally every news outlet, because his research kind of really set the groundwork for air quality during the pandemic. But he really and his team over at Harvard developed, what they call the 9 foundations of a healthy building, and those can be very similar to things like water quality, safety and security, active design. Each entity, and I'm just giving 3 examples, there's many others, kind of define a healthy building in a different way. But I think if you had to kind of boil it down, we look for things like improved air quality, which is surprisingly easy to do and has huge benefits to human health and wellness. People always ask me, like, what's the number one thing you can do in your space? It's like open a window, get some fresh air in there. And then things like biophilic design, access to natural lighting, reducing the toxins that are in those spaces. And then we can move into things like water quality, access to nutrition. If you're thinking about like what cafeteria might you have access to if you're back in an office building, active design, things like standing desks, encouraging people to use stairs, obviously keeping in mind various mobility challenges. But that's probably a much longer and cyclical answer than what you wanted, but it is hard to define a healthy building. And I think those terms are evolving right now, just like LEED. We use a lot of shorthand certification programs. So I might say, oh, that's a WELL Silver building. It's a WELL Platinum building. That's a Fitwel 2-star certified project. So we kind of use these various shorthands to define a healthy building. But you can look for kind of the trademarks of, obviously, you don't have to also certify a building to make it healthy, right? You can have a very healthy uncertified space. You can follow something like Harvard's work.
It sounds a little bit like, going beyond the traditional LEED certification program that's looking more at carbon footprint. This is looking more at how is it impacting the occupants inside of it, irrespective of necessarily the carbon footprint that it's emitting. Is that right?
Yeah, and the advocate in me would say it's really difficult to pull those 2 things apart, right? Because we know that climate change has so many impacts to human health and wellness and disproportionate impacts. So it can be kind of nice for academic purposes to kind of pull those things apart, say LEED and health and wellness. I hope we get to the point where we stop talking about green and healthy buildings, and that's just how we build. We just because we can. That's the advocate in me talking, but yeah, there's definitely, I would say, maybe a different focus. But folks like me who are practitioners of the space are always trying to demonstrate those intersections of environmental health with human health. Because they're important.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I don't think I knew that before you, unpacked it for me. So
share the knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. So as I understand it, another area that Sustainabl Strategies advises on is equity and inclusion within buildings. Can you talk a little bit about some projects that your firm is working on within this space right now?
Yeah, and I think just maybe a little bit more generally about inclusive spaces, because people often look at me and they go, "You're a sustainability person. Why are you even talking about this?" Yeah. And I've ended up talking about restrooms more than I ever wanted to in my whole career, Molly. But it ends up being one of those ways that buildings exclude. But so tying into your last question, right? So in my mind, the definition of a healthy building is one where people feel safe and included and welcome and do not experience things like harassment or unsafe spaces or being excluded from access to spaces. And also spaces that support people, give them the ability to do their best work. That gets into topics of neurodiversity and things like that, which we can get to in a minute. But so that those intersections of equity with healthy buildings and inclusion, say a building is not healthy if not everyone has access to it, right? If it excludes certain people. So one example too is that I do a lot of talking about restrooms, because speaking from my own experience, I'm a person who gets excluded or harassed in restrooms quite often. I guess I'll use the other words that people used to describe me as maybe an androgynous presenting person. I'm over 6 feet tall. I'm using words that other people apply to me just to share my own experience, right? And so I often get harassed or pulled out of restrooms, or I'll go in the women's restroom and someone will inevitably be like, "Oh, hey, you're in the wrong one." I'm like, "Thank you, I'm an adult, I can select the right restroom." This all begs the question of, why do we even segregate these spaces in this way? And we don't need to. We can create spaces that are welcoming to everyone and provide lots of other support services as well, like support for nursing mothers, support for single dads to have access to a changing station, things like sharps disposals for people who are, using hormones for a variety of different reasons, right? And so, we have a different, I think without going into projects specifically, but I do a lot of talking about and using restrooms as a good example of how can we create spaces where everyone feels safe. As someone, I could tell you and there are very few restrooms in downtown Seattle where I feel safe. And I know exactly where those are. And I'm not the only person who knows things like that, right? There's actually an app called Refuge where you can locate inclusive restrooms in whatever city that you're in. And so
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's too bad that we need something like that, but it does exist. And so to tie this back to the themes that we've been talking about, so we see a lot of negative health impacts, particularly to, like, for example, the trans community, of avoiding restroom usage. And so that's how we tie like poor exclusive building design to things like negative health impacts. And so that's why when people ask me, like, you look at sustainability and healthy buildings, like, why are you talking about inclusive spaces? Because there's all of these ways that buildings give us little clues that you are or not welcome there. Another one is if you see, like a rainbow sticker is probably the other, kind of classic example on a doorway that signals to certain groups that this is presumably a safer space for them to enter. And, I say all of this is kind of talking from my own experience. There's lots of other, voices and experiences that should be a part of these conversations about safety in public spaces. But
I think you bring up a great point obviously on all of this, especially, when you're talking about changing stations for dads, because, families take many different shapes and sizes these days. And, it's really a shame that there's public restrooms that only have it in the women's room with changing stations, is that's just not the way that the 21st century works. So
absolutely. And, I think to maybe the larger point or question, or again, the advocate in me is, we have great examples of really inclusive spaces. I use Town Hall Seattle as an example all the time. If you've ever been to Town Hall Seattle, their restroom is one of the, you walk in, it's a single entryway, single exit, single stalls, floor to ceiling doors, and then you walk through that space and then there's a row of common sinks. People can probably picture kind of what I'm talking about. You probably used a space like this and maybe didn't even think about it because you've never experienced the anxiety of having to look for a safe restroom. And so, right. But anyway, so there are these great examples. So again, I always challenge people, why don't we create more of these spaces? Says a lot about us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I understand it, another area that your firm advises and consults on is an area known as environmental and social governance, which most of our listeners probably know of. So what does ESG mean for the building sector, and does it impact building owners versus building operators differently?
I'm glad you're not going to make me define ESG, because I don't know that anyone can come up with a good definition of that at this particular moment in time. Yeah, it's a little bit in flux. But ESG definitely relates to the built environment. I think mostly because a couple of ways, but we're using ESG frameworks as ways of valuing different things from an investor standpoint. And buildings are very valuable, many of them, assets. And so how they perform from an environmental, social, probably a little less governance on the building side. That's more on the tenants that are in those spaces, I would guess. Very much plays into, I think, how these assets are going to be valued in the future, whether they're part of a portfolio or at the single building level. And, we've seen programs like WELL, which I referenced earlier, talk about how their standard or certification aligns with various ESG metrics. And that makes sense, right? Because we're kind of looking at, okay, if you're a building owner, how are we going to, are we going to go through the costs and time and things of certifying this space? Is it also going to, translate to a metric that we think will become, widely accepted once the SEC does their thing, and we kind of move through this process? Are we going to be able to translate these third-party certifications to kind of a meaningful tool that investors are now, using in the market, a signal that ESG is very much here to stay, right? And so I think that kind of connection is what's important. And then there's been arguments that there should be ESG and H, like adding the health. I think, yeah, I know. But people, I would say we've got more than enough, letters and acronyms as it is, and I think H is both E and S and G. It's part of it, but just considering those health impacts are very much a part of asset valuation. I think, again, particularly with respect to air quality, we have tenants asking, what are the ventilation rates? What are we doing about filtration? The pandemic, I think, really opened people's eyes to really drove the health conversation, and luckily it's pulling along some of these other aspects of health. But also, as we look at, like, what do tenants want in a building? They want a safe space, and that now looks like much more than code compliance and looking towards things like air quality, which will be part of the code in the future, I would say. But
what do you see as Sustainabl strategies' biggest challenge right now as you're assisting your clients with the transition to more of a sustainable built environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the client side, we are always fighting ideas of cost. It's too expensive. Why would we do that? There is, I think, real comfort in the status quo, and any type of friction is not welcome. And that's something we've been chasing forever. Sustainability is too expensive, and so what a lot of what I do is trying to get folks to what I call reframe risk. Many financial and other models, this is changing with ESG, but do not take into account costs of a rapidly changing climate or the negative health impacts to the folks who you're putting in these spaces. And we're both lawyers here, but if a space is unsafe and the research is showing that you could do a lot better with that space, and we're moving beyond like just pandemic viral transmission levels and into actually like cognitive performance, that small impacts in air quality can actually improve how people make decisions. I think continuing to not implement that research is potentially problematic. And so I get to try to get folks to kind of reframe these risks of, well, why would we try that new material? Why would we try it? Why would we do that new thing? With the way you've always been doing things hasn't gotten us to a very good place.
Exactly.
So I think that risk of the status quo, and I think this is, coming more and more to light of the real impacts of a really changing climate.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get people to understand that and say, well, maybe the risk of trying something new is not that risky. And that,
Mm-hmm.
relates to me in my work, right? Like, I'm a kind of a new type of consultant, and, I call myself a multidisciplinary practitioner. I think I'm more of a translator and a bridge builder because I can, speak to the legal community, and I can speak to the sustainability community, and I'm very embedded in the real estate community, teaching here at the real estate department at UW. And problems like climate change need multidisciplinary practitioners who can work in that space. And unfortunately, kind of going back to what we talked about at the beginning, we tend to kind of have these towers of the designers over here, the owners over here, the contractors over here, or the lawyers over here, the insurance industry over here, and the finance industry over here. And
Mm-hmm.
we really need collaboration to work on a challenge like climate change, which doesn't respect any of these jurisdictional or professional boundaries that we create. And so that was a long answer to your question, but I think I answered it, which is there's a lot of, questions of like getting clients, and if our clients are advocating, getting their clients to understand this risk might be worth taking, or maybe you're calling something a risk that isn't actually a risk. I get that a lot.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. It seems like half the work is convincing clients that now is the time to be making the move, because we're kind of running out of time. So
we're out of time, but yeah, there's a risk and there's an uninformed opinion. And I try to pull those two things apart, right? If it's a real risk, we have tools to manage things like that, like insurance. If it's an uninformed opinion, that just requires a lot of education. And I run into many more uninformed opinions than I do real risks.
Wow. Well, that's interesting.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're there changing, helping educate people.
I try.
So as you know, the Securities and Exchange Commission recently made some big waves in the arena of ESG reporting. On March 21st of this year, the SEC voted to propose a substantial new set of securities regulations that would, for the first time, impose detailed mandatory reporting requirements on domestic and foreign registrants to make a wide range of climate-related disclosures to the public. They're kind of in four buckets, I would say. One is disclosures on an annual basis of the registrant's direct greenhouse gas emissions. commonly referred to as Scope 1 emissions, as well as disclosures of indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the purchase of electricity and other forms of energy known as Scope 2 emissions. Then there's another bucket of disclosures essentially requiring an attestation report from independent third-party service providers. They are also potentially proposing to require disclosure of indirect upstream and downstream emissions from a registrant's value chain, only if the emissions, though, are material quantitatively or qualitatively, or if the company has set greenhouse gas emission reduction target that includes Scope 3. And then they've also just, required disclosure of how registrants are identifying and assessing kind of climate risk in general in several different facets. And so Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are obviously directly tied to the built environment, but I am wondering if you see any particular challenges to implementing the reporting rules as a whole within the built environment, especially with respect to Scope 3.
Yeah, I mean, I think in green buildings, sustainable building, we saw standards like LEED go from kind of moment in time, this is your checklist, and the building is performing this way, or the building is designed this way, excuse me, that's an important distinction, to what we have now, which are like building performance standards, just like Washington's Healthy Buildings Act. And so we really saw, I think, a robustness in certification kind of shift when we moved away from moment in time to, performance verified by third party certification, as opposed to, okay, this is the way the building was designed. We looked at the documentation, we checked the boxes, to give us a year's worth of your operational data, and then we'll certify your project. I promise I'm going to tie this to ESG, because I think there's a lot of lessons that ESG can learn from early green building, right? And so what I really think is of value potentially in what the SEC is proposing is that kind of independent third-party validation, attestation, those types of things. And I can only speak about kind of the nitty-gritty of that at a pretty high level. But that, I think, is a key to making, that what the SEC is proposing actually have some, as we would use this term, teeth to it. And then I think, with respect to Scope 3, there are a lot of, I'm concerned that, and I think a lot of people are concerned that, there's going to be litigation or disincentivization to set things like science-based targets because of the way the SEC's proposed, language is worded, right? You don't have to report Scope 3, as I understand it, if you don't set a science-based target or if it's not material. Was the term that you used. And so I hope that companies still report Scope 3, because as we know, it can get to, as much as 90 or 95% of emissions. And so I guess on the practitioner advocate side of me has concerns. And I don't know if you've looked at the comments to the proposed rulemaking lately, but there's not very many substantive comments, I would say. And so I'm always kind of encouraging people to go in and comment and add these things. But to tie that to the built environment, right, I think there are a lot of choices that like building owners, for example, can make with respect to Scope 3 emissions. And we look even beyond that to like transportation, where are the building materials coming from, all kinds of different aspects. And then when the project is actually built, what kind of vendors are you using to bring things to the project? Could range, take the office space that KNL rents, for example, right? Like what vendors are you bringing for catering? Things like that, I think could fall into how are your employees traveling? As a sustainability person, when I think of going to conferences where people are, offer me speaking opportunities to fly somewhere, you got to think about the optics on that. If you're going to fly me as a sustainability expert all over the place, I'd like to go, but, I am mindful of those things. And I think so. I think Scope 3, we can get a little bit like, oh, that doesn't apply. But if you think about it, it does in a lot of different ways, including the built environment. So I'm hoping that, building owners and the really progressive companies that we've seen really, set robust science-based targets and get serious about them and kind of set that standard regardless of what the SEC ultimately does. And I hope we don't see a bunch of litigation.
I hope so too. Yeah. We'll see. How do you anticipate ESG within the built environment evolving over the next decade?
I think that's another big TBD. I think for whatever reason, like I said, buildings and right, like sustainability is this really broad scope, right? Like I happen to work in buildings, people work in like apparel and transportation and, textiles and chemicals and all kinds of different things, right? And so ESG is going to impact all those different industries, differently. But with respect to the built environment, we're kind of used to these third-party certifications being a part of daily practice, right? Like, so like LEED's been around since 1990. For my students, I have this chart of all the different certifications that are available, only talking about the US, and it gets extensive at some point. So I think we're used to that. We're also really used to these certification programs being incorporated into law, which is what we're seeing the SEC doing now, right? They're taking these kind of GRI, TCFD, SASB, whatever, and there's whatever they decide ultimately, right? But, they're kind of taking these other things and using them as their framework. And we've seen using them as part of a regulatory framework, right? And we've seen that with respect to LEED all over the place, right? The city of Seattle has incentives tied to LEED and the Living Building Challenge, and so does the state, and so do many other states. And so I guess your question, where do I see the future of ESG with respect to buildings? I think and hope that the building sector is actually going to, take a leadership role, because we are pretty familiar with these things and the issues. And I think there's a lot of kind of, like I said, lessons learned with respect to, LEED's early days and other, not to pick on LEED, but LEED, drove huge market transformation. And I hope the building design and operations communities, kind of continue that.
Yeah, I hope so too. Within the specific arena of EJ communities and the intersection of EJ communities with the built environment, how do you see environmental justice communities changing in the next decade? Whether it be from SEC disclosure rules for, publicly traded companies or not, do you see there being room for improvement?
Coming back to your earlier question or point about this idea of healthy for the wealthy is something we definitely want to avoid, right? And, we saw ideas with respect to energy use and performance in affordable housing, and the importance of, the less you make, the larger impact your energy costs have overall. And so, there are, disproportionate impacts of things like energy use, which we've seen kind of LEED and energy performance standards work on. And I think as we move towards health and also environmental social governance factors, we want to see all of these kind of frameworks that support health and wellness in buildings apply to things like affordable housing and as well as, big commercial spaces downtown. So it's always, I think, takes people like me coming to a podcast like this and, your listeners kind of keeping this, as I said, like equity lens and applying it to this work. And I just say, we're going to focus ESG, and, the SEC's proposed rules, as you said, apply to really large companies, and then it, scaled down as we move. But I think it's important to think about, as you said, just keep having those conversations, keep pushing it. Like I said, I can't tell you how many times I talk about bathrooms on a given day, but, and I have those conversations are very uncomfortable for me. I'm not going to lie, but, it's important that we have them. And I can only speak from my personal experience, right? Like I said, there's lots of different ways that the built environment and climate change have disproportionate impacts. And we need to keep bringing other voices into these conversations and making sure that those people have an opportunity, those communities and groups have an opportunity to share their experience as well. And I think hopefully that will help with, just creating better spaces, because we can. And so we should.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you, Nicole, for your very informative explanations on all my questions. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of those of you who are listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. We hope that you will join us again soon as we continue to explore the intersection of environmental, social, and economic sustainability. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, subscribe by searching Hub Talks, that's HUB Talks, in your favorite podcast app. We hope you will tune in next time to learn more about the outlook of the burgeoning sustainable economy.